It was the kind of place no one dared to speak about, yet everyone knew existed. An abandoned railway tunnel, carved deep into the rocky hills beyond the town's reach, hidden away like a secret no one wanted to admit. It was called Black Hollow Tunnel, and the legends surrounding it were enough to keep even the most reckless teenagers from going near it after dark. Some said a train derailed inside nearly a century ago, the fire consuming every passenger, their screams forever trapped in the walls. Others believed it was a ritual site, a place where people disappeared and were never seen again. There was no official record of anything happening there, but even in the modern age, stories persisted. And yet, we still, when it was Mark's idea, of course. You guys believe in all that ghost train crap? He scoffed, kicking a stone across the gravel as we stood at the tunnel's entrance. The jagged opening was like a gaping mouth, the darkness inside swallowing the last rays of daylight. I swallowed. No, but then prove it, he grinned. 10 minutes inside, that's it. We walk in, get some footage, and leave. Easy. I didn't like it. Neither did Jamie, Mark's girlfriend, who clutched his arm. This place gives me the creeps, she whispered. The air smells weird. She was right. The air was thick, damp, and carried the faintest scent of something rotten. Come on, it's just an old tunnel, said Tyler, the skeptic of the group. What's the worst that could happen? A homeless guy jumps out at us? I sighed. Fine, but if I hear one weird thing, I'm out. Mark laughed. Whatever you say, Ethan. And with that, we stepped inside. The moment we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. I'm not talking about a small shift. I mean, 1 second we were in late summer heat. The next it felt like midwinter. My breath fogged in front of me. Jamie shivered. Jesus, she muttered, rubbing her arms. Tyler clicked his flashlight on, the beam barely penetrating the thick darkness. The tunnel was long, the walls covered in graffiti and dripping moisture. Water pooled along the edges of the tracks, the rusted metal rails barely visible beneath the grime. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not surprising. Ben, you getting all this? Mark asked. Ben, our quiet friend and designated cameraman, gave a nod as his camera's red light blinked. Cool. Let's go deeper. We walked, the crunch of our footsteps echoing eerily. 5 minutes in, and the silence became suffocating. No wind, no insects, just our own breathing and the distant sound of dripping water. Then we heard it, a long, metallic screech. It came from somewhere deep inside the tunnel. Jamie froze. Did you hear that? Probably just metal shifting, Tyler shrugged. Then didn't look so sure. Mark rolled his eyes. It's an old railway. Stuff rusts, it makes noise. I wanted to believe him. But the sound hadn't been random creaking. It had been deliberate, like the screech of brakes, the kind you'd hear if a train was coming to a stop. I forced a laugh. Yeah, well, let's just get to the halfway mark and go. Mark nodded. Agreed. We continued walking deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, the darkness felt thicker, and then Ben's camera blinked off. And at the same time, the screeching started again. Louder this time, and getting closer. The screeching grew louder, a metallic, ear-piercing wail that rattled my skull. It wasn't a distant sound anymore. It was moving, traveling through the tunnel like something enormous was being dragged across rusted tracks. Ben fumbled with his camera, hitting the power button repeatedly. "What the hell?" he muttered. "It just shut off. Low battery?" I asked, though my voice was tight. Ben shook his head. "No, it was fully charged." Jamie grabbed Mark's sleeve. "We should leave." Mark forced a laugh, but I could hear the nervous edge in his voice. "Guys, chill. It's just old metal shifting. You're freaking out over nothing." Then every single flashlight flickered. For a second, the tunnel plunged into pure darkness. I swear my heart stopped beating. The light returned a moment later, but it was weaker, like the darkness had drained the batteries. Ben turned to me, his face pale. "Ethan, I don't think we're alone." A new sound joined the screeching, a distant rhythmic thudding. I held my breath. It almost sounded like footsteps. No, not footsteps. Something heavier, like the slow, deliberate stomping of a massive weight shifting through the tunnel's depths. "Who's there?" Tyler called, his voice cracking. Silence. The air felt thicker, pressing against my chest like I was breathing underwater. Then came a new noise, low, guttural whispers, slithering through the tunnel from all directions. Ben's camera flickered back to life. The screen showed static, then suddenly a dark figure standing right behind us. We spun around. Nothing was there, but the air felt wrong. Jamie was crying softly, gripping Mark's hand so tight her knuckles went white. "This isn't funny anymore," she whimpered. "Let's go back." Even Mark wasn't smirking anymore. "Yeah," he muttered. "Good idea." We turned to leave, and the screeching became deafening. It was coming toward us. A burst of icy wind blasted through the tunnel, bringing with it the overwhelming stench of burning flesh. I gagged, and then we saw it. The train. The train wasn't normal. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't a trick of the eyes either. It was a spectral thing, its rusted metal form shimmering between reality and something else, like a flickering image on a dying screen. The headlights were dim and unnatural, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely cut through the thick darkness. Worst of all, it was coming fast. Jamie screamed. Mark froze. Tyler dropped his flashlight, his breath coming in panic gasps. "Run!" I shouted, but there was nowhere to run. We were deep inside the tunnel, and the only way out was past the oncoming train. The sound was unbearable now, metal screeching, sparks flying, and something underneath it wailing in agony. Then, for just a moment, I saw the passengers. Charred faces pressed against the windows, mouths open in silent screams. Their blackened skin was cracked, exposing bone and glowing embers beneath. Their eyes were still moving, darting frantically from side to side as if looking for a way to escape. But there was no escape for them. And if we didn't move, there would be no escape for us either. Ben grabbed my arm. "This isn't real," he gasped. "It's an illusion." But it felt real. The heat, the noise, the overwhelming terror. Then everything stopped. The screeching cut off instantly like someone had flipped a switch. The train was gone. The tunnel was silent. But the air, it was wrong, colder than before, heavier. And then the whispers returned. This time, they were right beside us. A deep, guttural voice slithered through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come." Jamie whimpered. Tyler was muttering a prayer under his breath. I turned to Mark. His face was ashen, eyes locked on something in the distance. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. There was something standing in the tunnel, just beyond the reach of our flickering flashlights. A shadowy figure, taller than any human, with elongated limbs and a gaping mouth that seemed to stretch forever. It was watching us, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures began to emerge, their shapes shifting and twisting like they were struggling to remain in our reality. Ben lifted his camera, and suddenly his screen filled with dozens of faces. Burned, twisted, mouths wide in agony. Then, in a single inhuman voice, they spoke. "Join us." The words didn't echo the way they should have in the tunnel. They seemed to crawl into my ears directly, like 100 voices whispering from inside my own skull. Ben let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling around the camera. The screen kept flickering, showing our surroundings, then flashing to those burned, agonized faces. Jamie clutched Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "I want to go home," she whispered, voice cracking. So did I. But the figures weren't letting us leave. The tall, shadowed thing in front of us tilted its head, its body creaking like ancient, rusted metal shifting under pressure. Then it moved, not stepping forward but gliding like it wasn't walking but being pulled toward us. Tyler lost it. He turned and sprinted into the darkness. "Tyler, no!" Mark yelled, but it was too late. The shadows swallowed him whole. For a moment, all we heard was the sound of his footsteps pounding against the tunnel floor. Then, a high-pitched shriek tore through the air. Tyler screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was distorted, stretching unnaturally, twisting into something that wasn't human anymore. And then silence. Ben was breathing hard. "W, we have to get out of here." I turned my flashlight down the tunnel in the direction Tyler had run. There was no sign of him, just the dark and the whispering. The tall figure let out a long, deep sigh, like it was disappointed. Then it spoke again. "Not enough." A cold pressure wrapped around my wrist, and I realized with absolute horror something was pulling me forward. I fought it. I struggled, kicked, screamed, but I wasn't moving on my own. I was being dragged toward the shadows. Jamie grabbed my other arm, trying to pull me back. Ethan, Mark Joyner, then Ben, all of them pulling, screaming my name. But it wasn't enough. The shadows were stronger. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Jamie's terrified face, her mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear. Then everything went black. I wasn't in the tunnel anymore. I was somewhere else. A train station. Or at least, what used to be one. The tracks were twisted and broken, covered in black soot and dried blood. The walls were crumbling, and the air was filled with the scent of burned flesh. And the people, dozens of them, standing completely still, their charred bodies frozen in place, staring straight ahead like passengers waiting for a train that would never come. The whispers were everywhere now, not from the figures, from below. I looked down and saw hands pushing up from beneath the tracks, clawing at the air, reaching for me. My breath caught in my throat. I knew where I was. The train never crashed. It never derailed. It just never stopped. And now I was on it. The train wasn't coming. It was already here. The figures standing around me, those charred, lifeless bodies, suddenly turned their heads in unison, their blackened eyes locking onto me. Their mouths, those burned, twisted mouths, began to open wider and wider, their lips cracking, the smell of smoke and decay filling my lungs. And then from the darkness of the tunnel, I heard it, the screeching, a metallic, bone-rattling sound that sent a violent shiver down my spine. The train was approaching, and this time, I wasn't just watching it. I was on the tracks. I whirled around, desperately searching for an exit. But there was nowhere to go. The tunnel stretched on forever in both directions, impossibly long, far longer than it had been when we first entered. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, the very stone beneath my feet trembling. The shadows around me started to shift, moving like a living thing, slithering across the walls, the floor, my skin. And then, from the depths of the tunnel, I saw it. The train, a monstrous thing, half real, half nightmare, its headlights burning with a sickly yellow glow. The wheels screamed against the rails, sparks flying in every direction, the metal groaning like it was alive and in pain. And behind the cracked, soot-covered windows, the passengers were waiting. "No!" I screamed, stumbling backward. The train was moving too fast to escape. The figures around me began to move, their burned bodies jerking unnaturally, as if they were nothing more than puppets on invisible strings. Then one of them spoke, a dry, rasping whisper that came from deep within its throat. "You are one of us now." I felt it before I saw it, a coldness, deeper than anything I'd ever known, sinking into my bones. And then hands, dozens of them, pushing up from the ground, clutching at my legs, my arms, my throat. I fought. I kicked and screamed, but they were strong. They were pulling me down. The train was almost here. Its screeching filled my head, drowning out my thoughts, my breath, my very existence. I saw Tyler's face among the passengers now, his skin burned and cracked, his mouth open in an endless, soundless scream. "Help me!" I sobbed, but there was no one left to help, and then something grabbed my wrist. Hard. It wasn't the burned hands. It was Ben. He was screaming my name, his eyes wild with terror. I barely saw Jamie and Mark behind him, pulling with everything they had. For a split second, I thought they'd let go, that they'd leave me to become part of the train. But they didn't. With one final yank, I was ripped from the shadows, my body slamming onto the tunnel floor just as the train passed through me. And for that brief, agonizing moment, I saw everything. I saw the crash. The original train, the real one, had never stopped at its station. It had plunged straight into the tunnel at full speed, carrying its screaming passengers into an inferno of steel and fire. But the train never left. The wreckage was never cleared. The passengers never escaped. And now, every year on this night it returns, looking for more souls to take. I woke up outside the tunnel, the night air cold against my skin. Ben was beside me, gasping for breath. Jamie was crying. Mark just stared at the tunnel entrance, his face pale as death. Tyler was gone. The tunnel was silent again, like nothing had ever happened, like it was waiting for its next visitors. I looked down at my arm, where the hands had grabbed me. My skin was bruised black. The imprints of charred fingers burned into my flesh. And in the distance, from the depths of the tunnel, I still heard it, the screeching, waiting for someone else to enter, for someone else to join them.